Some of the ideas that have most changed the world have one very interesting thing in common. Most people said they were wrong and they wouldn't work. And organisations actively killed them off, often multiple times, only to see them come back again. At a time when we need new ideas to solve some of the problems in front of us, and some of the ones at hand are being dismissed by some as unproven and likely to fail, it's worth understanding what have we learned from history about how to change the world with breakthrough technology. And by answering that question, we also find the answer to another one. How come so many of the ideas that shaped the last 2 centuries were thought of first in China, but ultimately were realised by the West? My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. If you want to change the world, you have to understand the processes by which the world is changed. And of course, there are a number of different ways that change happens. In this video, I want to focus on innovation. And the ideas and examples for it come from Safi Bakal's book, Loonshots. Link provided in the description below. Let's start off with one of the stories that Bakal talks about in that book. In the 1960s, researchers had identified that high cholesterol in the blood was responsible for high risks of heart attacks and strokes. A Japanese scientist, Akira Endo, started looking for a drug that lowered cholesterol. And after extensive research, he found a blue-green mould that grew on rice that seemed to block a key enzyme needed to make cholesterol. The results seemed highly promising. However, by the time he'd gotten to the point to share his results, the world had seen numerous failures to reduce cholesterol by diet, and other drugs that attempted to do it had all failed in trials because they were found to increase overall death rates. By the time he presented his results for the drug at a conference, everyone had given up hope of being able to lower cholesterol. No one paid attention. The idea died a death. But he carried on working on it, although he was worried his company might fire him at any point, given the lack of apparent potential for his idea. He and his team reached the important stage of testing the drug in live animals, and they did it as normal on rats, expecting validation. Didn't work. No apparent impact in lowering cholesterol at all. Now, such a failure at that point generally kills a project. At that stage, there was no chance of convincing the company to continue developing or evaluating the drug, and usually people would stop there. It's a dead-end proposition. However, Endo managed to get agreement for just one more go to figure out what had gone wrong. Most companies wouldn't have granted it, but he was lucky. And then he had a random conversation with a colleague about a chicken. I kid you not, it made sense in context. In any case, it occurred to him that since eggs are high in cholesterol, maybe that meant that chickens were too. They tried it on chickens. The results were spectacular. The drug decreased cholesterol by nearly half with no ill effects. And it turns out that rats have mostly what's called HDL, which is good cholesterol, and not much LDL, the bad cholesterol they wanted to reduce. Like humans, chickens have both. Things moved on and it got to the point where there could be a human trial. One seriously ill patient had dangerously high cholesterol. The drug was used and it worked. Endo at that point was happy the drug was now in good hands, retired from his company Sankyo, and went to do other things. However, soon after, a study suggested that high doses of the drug caused cancer in dogs. The company decided to pull the plug, it stopped the trials and gave up. Endo thought the dog trial was probably flawed, but he was now on the sidelines, and he could only watch as his program collapsed. Third death. In the event, a third party proved that the dog study was flawed. Another company, Merck, ended up reviving an identical project as a result, and the drug turned into the first statin. The first statins became Merck's most successful drugs, with cumulative sales of $90 billion, benefits that the first company failed to realise because it had walked away too soon. And this is a pattern that you see over and over again. Brilliant new technologies, whether it be radar used for detecting submarines in wartime, cancer drugs, jet engine planes, the Polaroid instant camera, computer animation, breakthrough ideas, killed multiple times before emerging triumphant. And how do they emerge? Largely because organisations are created that nurture crazy ideas, tolerate them, try them out, encourage them. You have to separate the creative ideas, what Bakal calls loonshots, from the production side where you need consistency and efficiency. And if you don't do that separation, then the good teams in production will simply kill the loon shots. And you have to nurture both. But you have to have frequent communication between them so that you know what problems you're solving. And it goes way beyond that. Certain types of organisations enable creative ideas to thrive, certain others will kill it. For instance, the size of the group working on something matters. Fewer than 150 people, you can organise people to focus on the project and to prioritise increasing its chance of success. More than that, you start to get internal politics and careerism, where there are perverse incentives and people will aim to enhance their promotion prospects by supporting sure things, which tend to be sequels of previously successful things rather than high-risk unknown projects. When you think about how we change the world, we rarely think about this. We know that technology can solve problems, but we don't focus on what sort of organisations and systems create that sort of technology, and what sort of organisations suppress it. But as various people point out, perverse incentives are a huge factor in making systems go bad. The book Freakonomics showed how perverse incentives can lead to cheating in sumo wrestling or teachers faking exams. The Loon Shots book gives another great example of perverse incentives when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered by Bedouin shepherds in a desert cave. Archaeologists offered to pay for each new scrap of parchment that they found, which sounds very reasonable. How could that go wrong? Except that it created an incentive for the shepherds to sit there tearing up the parchments into tiniest scraps that they could to maximise their income from the finding. So if you want to change the world with innovation, you have to create the right system that nurtures the type of innovation you need with the right incentives. What about that other question I asked at the beginning? Why is it that so many of the inventions that fueled the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution were discovered or thought of first in China, but failed to deliver the benefits until they arose in the West? Paper and printing, the magnetic compass, gunpowder, cannons, crankshafts, cast iron, paper currency, astronomical observatories. China was way ahead. It had higher literacy rates, it was larger, wealthier, and more technologically advanced than anyone. But China turned inward, big projects. A new capital, the Great Wall, the Grand Canal. It stopped being interested in new wacky ideas. So for instance, Sheng Kuo was an extraordinary polymath scientist. He was a mathematician, astronomer, meteorologist, geologist, entomologist, anatomist, climatologist, zoologist, botanist, pharmacologist, medical scientist, agronomist, archaeologist. He was an ethnographer, a cartographer, geographer, a geophysicist, mineralogist, encyclopedist, military general, diplomat, hydraulic engineer, inventor, economist, academy chancellor, finance minister, philosopher, art critic, poet and musician. In his spare time, he would play computer games. All right, the very last bit is the only bit that I made up. Unsurprisingly, he was in charge of the best astronomical observatory in China in the 11th century. Shen was head of the Imperial Bureau of Astronomy. He had the support of the emperor himself. He achieved huge things in science. And he became fascinated with the bizarre motions of the planets in the sky, which didn't make sense if everything was supposed to revolve around the Earth. He intensively studied it for years at significant cost, but eventually he lost that political support. For reasons unconnected with the astronomy work, he was ousted from the government, defeated by politics. End. Centuries later, along came Tycho Brahe. He took charge of the best astronomical observatory in Europe. He had the support of the King of Denmark. The same pattern was followed. He began research into the motion of the planets. It was a huge undertaking and was expensive. But then the King of Denmark died, and the new 19-year-old king and Tycho quickly fell out. Tycho's funding was cut. Tycho was forced into exile. There was one important difference. In Shen's case, there was nowhere for him to go. The Chinese Empire was the only game in town. And without the support of the emperor, he had nothing. In Tycho's case, he was able to hunt around Europe and find a new patron, King Rudolf II in Prague. And that eventually led to the breakthroughs that were the beginning of modern astronomy. This is one reason why large authoritarian regimes are rarely innovative. and is the reason why capitalist societies, with all of the many different companies and the potential for new disruptive startups and the rest, have been so innovative. And it's the reason why Europe at that time, with its various dynamic nations, with different leaders and wealthy patrons, became the seat of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly in the UK, where the Royal Society of London was created in 1660 as a gathering point for the key figures in modern science, somewhere that was dedicated to supporting invention and creativity, the creation of a scientific community to facilitate invention. It created the circumstances in one country that made it the early home for the engine of the Industrial Revolution. Now, if you've been going on wealth and historical advantages, you'd have bet on China or India or Islam to create the technological revolution. But for the same reason why IBM missed the software revolution and Microsoft missed the mobile revolution in turn, and it took Tesla to kickstart the age of the electric car, big empires are not where innovation happens. Not unless they structure themselves to nurture the loonshot ideas, which they generally don't. I think about all of that when I hear talk about carbon capture technologies for a future where we have to tackle climate change, and when campaigners dismiss such emergent technologies as not proven. The good news is we have multiple startups working on different approaches, and because of the known imperative of these technologies, some of the most promising ones are attracting significant investment. There are always 20 good reasons to dismiss breakthrough ideas, and only ever just one to keep going with them. It doesn't mean that all of them come to fruition. It just means that lurking somewhere in there, there's probably one killer application waiting. The history of innovation is that technical problems are solvable, but the Loonshots book shows that there's nothing inevitable, that we discover the thing that's just waiting there to be discovered. We have to organise smartly to do it. We have to persist in our belief that we'll do it. You only have to look at the history of Elon Musk and Tesla to see how exactly the same process, multiple near-death experiences in a corporate sense, overcome by creativity and invention and sheer determination, was essential in creating the product that helped galvanise the industry into seeing electric cars as the future. People often say climate change won't be as difficult as people think because human ingenuity will come up with answers. Well, it certainly could. It doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen on its own. And for those on the other side who say that capitalism has to be overthrown for the sake of a sustainable future, you have to say that on a purely pragmatic basis, this sort of track record suggests otherwise, especially when people are so obscure about exactly what they think the replacement would look like. And in that vein as well, it's interesting that when it comes to fourth generation nuclear, the country that's most gung-ho to trial new technologies is China. But most of the ideas behind the technologies they'll be trialling came from the US or elsewhere. This analysis would not hold up hope that China becomes a major force of innovation on climate change. It can decide to go all in on an emerging technology if it chooses to, but it would be hard for it to nurture the crazy ideas where the most important breakthroughs come from. Hard, not impossible. The US government set up a departure to nurture new ideas during the Second World War, but it was led by very individualistic leaders who were given a lot of backing and freedom, and that's not really playing to the Chinese government's strengths. That last speculation is all me. Other than that, a lot of this came from the Loonshots book, which I heartily recommend as a book for those who seriously want to learn about how change can happen in a complex society like ours.